I think one of the things that the show did really well was, as soon as the relationship became real and became authentic, it kind of, some of the glamour went away. And that is actually what happens in marriage. I've had so many single people tell me after they get married, I feel duped. Where's the sparks flying and everything? Sometimes people just go in with the wrong perspective. In the Torah outlook, the way God created relationships, and really a lot of things in the physical world, is you start with this spark of inspiration. That spark is then sort of meant to be there to guide you to see what to aspire to. The spark is taken away, and then you have to work to bring it back.
This is the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish perspective podcast, where we take ambiguous moral situations in fictional popular movies and TV shows and analyze them from a Torah lens. As a quick overview, The Office is a television show that takes place in Scranton, Pennsylvania, about Dunder Mifflin, a company that sells paper. The company has multiple branches, but we're mostly focused on the Scranton branch. There are probably about 15 characters in Scranton, which includes the manager, secretary, salesman, and accountants. One of those characters is Jim Halpert, a funny, charming guy, and he's in his late 20s or early 30s. There's also Pam Beasley, who's the secretary, and is Jim's love interest. Jim and Pam slowly bond through the first 2 seasons, sharing jokes together, pranking one of their coworkers, Dwight, and generally having a great time. They have undeniable chemistry. The thing is, Pam is engaged to Roy. As expected, this becomes a key point of tension in the earlier seasons between Jim and Pam and Roy. Now, Roy is not a good match for Pam, but she refuses to acknowledge it or act upon it. So that's how the first season goes. And then throughout the second season, Pam's romantic feelings for Jim become more evident, although Pam herself seems to be ignorant or in denial of their existence. Now, on casino night, during the season finale, Jim decides to come clean about his feelings for Pam, to which Pam responds by pointing out once again how important their friendship is to her, and that she's sorry he misunderstood their interactions together. Jim, unsatisfied with Pam's response, kisses her, and she kisses him back, while she's still engaged to Roy. Now, after Jim and Pam part from their kiss, Pam says that she still has to honor her commitment to Roy and tells Jim that she plans to go through with the wedding. Disappointed and heartbroken, Jim accepts a position at a different branch of the company in a different city. Pam eventually decides to call off the wedding and is seen clearly missing Jim's presence in the office. Pam continues to show multiple signs of remorse over her decision to reject Jim and is clearly excited about his return to Scranton after the closing of the Stamford branch, which is where Jim was. Now, while Pam is excited about rekindling their friendship, Jim is still unsure of how he feels about her and has already started a relationship with one of his coworkers, Karen, who also transferred to Scranton to continue her relationship with Jim. It eventually becomes clear, however, that Jim still has unresolved feelings towards Pam, which start to cause problems in his relationship with Karen. Pam eventually grows tired of hiding her feelings from Jim, and on Beach Day, which is one of the episodes in season 3, she confesses to him in front of the entire office staff that he was the true reason she called off her wedding and that she misses his friendship. As you can imagine, Jim and Karen eventually break up, and finally, soon after this, Jim makes the move and asks Pam out on a date. Their relationship is officially on. Now, over the next few seasons, Jim and Pam date, they get married, they have kids, and though they go through some tensions, like Pam's stay in art school, Jim's professional aspirations, the fact that, there's sometimes some missing emotional bonding that's required, they often represent to many people a wonderful relationship and how things eventually get resolved through their interactions and their love for one another. With that, we have a few questions we'd like answered. Jim and Pam's relationship seems amazing for many reasons. They were friends before they got together, they had chemistry, they respected each other. However, this was happening while Pam and Roy were engaged. It's true, Roy was not the right guy for Pam, right? He wasn't emotionally supportive of her. He was just kind of lingering on in this 3-year engagement with no final wedding date until much later on in the show. So our questions are, was it appropriate for Jim and Pam to be so close while Pam was engaged to Roy? We know that kissing crosses a line. That's obvious. But what about before? There was all this emotional buildup. Does that cross the line somehow? On a related note, were Jim and Pam sufficiently honest with their partners, Roy and Karen, before pursuing each other? With respect to Pam and Roy, was Pam sufficiently honest with Roy? Roy could be kind of a scary guy, as we see in the scene where he trashes the bar after Pam tells him she kissed Jim. Doesn't that give her, Pam, grounds to explore her options? She's scared. She's human. So maybe she's just trying to see what happens. She's in this relationship. She doesn't know about it. So she's exploring something else. What's the Torah's take on that? Shifting our focus to Jim and Karen, let's discuss. Jim still had feelings for Pam, even though he was dating Karen. But Pam rejected him. Jim tried something new and broke it off when he finally realized he wanted to pursue Pam. That's fair, isn't it? Or, from a Jewish perspective, do we expect 100% emotional commitment during a relationship? That kind of seems unrealistic. Jim was exploring, there was chemistry between Jim and Karen, and then it didn't work out, and he moved on. So how do we view that? And then lastly, will the Torah see Jim and Pam as an ideal love story, a realistic one, or a problematic one? Or is it all three, and why? I am excited to welcome Rabbi Yoni Spinka to this episode to answer our questions. Yoni Spinka is a sought-after keynote speaker, executive performance coach, and rabbi with over a decade of experience blending ancient mystical wisdom with modern psychology and coaching methodologies. As the CEO of Spinka Group Coaching and Consulting, he partners with executives and CEOs to foster clarity and strategic direction, driving transformational growth. Previously, Yoni served for 7 years as a rabbi at the University of Pennsylvania, where he taught Jewish spiritual practices and mentored hundreds of students through personal and professional challenges. He currently lives in the suburbs of Philadelphia with his wife and 5 children. To inquire about coaching or to book Yoni for a keynote speech at your organization, please contact him at yonispinka@gmail.com. I will attach his contact info below. Rabbi Spinka, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you, Ophir, for being persistent in trying to get me to join this podcast. I admire the fact that you ignored all of my ignoring of you for many, many months, and it's finally happening. I'm excited. It's a real lesson. Just kind of, if you want to do something, just keep at it, and eventually it can happen. So well done.
Good. Thank you, and thank you for taking it in the right way. Appreciate that.
I'm happy that we're finally doing it, and that you were persistent in making sure this could happen, and I'm really excited for our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. All right. So getting into it. So The Office, the Jim and Pam relationship, probably one of the most famous kind of on-screen romances that there is. And I want to address it. I think we can all acknowledge that, Jim and Pam kissing at the end of season 2 was kind of crossing a line that was inappropriate. So I want to actually head back towards the beginning in terms of, at the beginning of the show, Jim pretty quickly develops feelings for Pam. That's pretty obvious. But it seems like at the beginning, Pam was just kind of like, it was a friend, close confidant. They like joking around together. It was like a fun friendship that kind of made being in the office, like more lighthearted, more engaging to be in the office. So I guess my question is, at what point do we say like there's too much emotional investment here and like a line has been crossed? We know that kissing is crossing a line. Just chatting with your coworkers and having, nobody wants to be like the Angela of the office where like, no smiling, no joking, no fun. Nobody wants to be that person. So like how does the Torah approach that?
Yeah. So look, it's a really good question. And I think especially when you talk about The Office and Jim and Pam, it seems to be one of the most popular series out there. I myself, I don't really get to watch, much of these series. But so many people were telling me about this and this particular dynamic, and they would ask me questions about it. So I decided to I got to go check this out. And I get why it has such a draw to it. So I think it kind of really, there's a lot of things to kind of we can focus on, and we'll hopefully get through in the conversation. But to answer your question directly, like where is the line? And there obviously can't be an exact line, right? If there clearly was, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. I think everybody can know. We can know when the line is crossed. For example, when they kiss and Pam is engaged, that's clearly overstepping the boundaries. But I think really the question you're trying to get to in the heart of it is, at what point is the relationship amongst co-workers feels like it's stepping over the line? So the first thing I kind of just want to frame is the Torah is going to speak around principles, and then we have to try to apply those principles to everyday scenarios. So the Torah cannot be speaking about somebody in an office that just didn't exist back then, but it does speak about how we're supposed to interact with members of the opposite sex. And one of the things I want to really sort of open up and just begin with is the seriousness with which the Torah approaches male-female dynamics. And, we know that there's this idea of men and women are allowed to marry certain people and not allowed to marry other people, called erva or rayas. Like there's certain relationships that we just deem inappropriate. A clearly obvious one would be incest, right? A man and his sister. But the language that the Torah employs is actually really telling, and I think can really reveal a lot about how the Torah views relationships between the opposite gender. The language the Torah uses is this expression of lo sikravu legalos ervosa. Do not approach to come close to revealing another person's nakedness who you're not supposed to be in a relationship with. So it's this unique language of kurva, of closeness, that the Torah wants you to not even get close to the sort of forbidden fruits. Now, you don't find this by other areas. The Torah doesn't say, don't get close to eating a cheeseburger. Don't get close to eating, a pig. You don't see that expression. It says, don't do the forbidden act. And yet when it comes to this dynamic of relationships, the Torah recognizes that it clearly has a gray area. And if we were to define it as clearly only the mark in which you've crossed the line, too many people are going to falter and fall. And because of that, the Torah really puts in this idea of not even coming close to a prohibition. So I think it's just important to lay down the framework that the Torah's seriousness with which it takes this dynamic of relationships between people that we shouldn't be having a relationship with, ultimately a physical relationship. Because of that, it warns us and cautions us to even keep a distance from it as well. So I think that should be an important just framework and ground break to start with.
That is interesting, because I like, in terms of that kind of comes full circle. You said that it's hard to draw the line in the sand. There is no line. And that's why there's almost like a no man's land. I am not a military expert in any way, shape, or form, but it's well known that there's the clearly, say, in World War II, there's clearly the German side, there's clearly the French side. And it's not like they were kissing at that point. There's an area where neither one crossed. It wasn't the Germans and it wasn't the French. There's just, don't touch this area. So it's that kind of fair analogy. Look, this is clearly crossing the line. Here you're safe. Just don't get anywhere near there.
Exactly. And I think because of the fact that we all know that let's say, we'll call the line the physical side. If anybody who's in a committed relationship, if your partner or spouse were to be physical with somebody else of the opposite sex, we can all agree that's the line. So the Torah doesn't speak per se directly to the line. It says don't get close to the line.
Got it.
The Torah is telling us that by definition in this dynamic, if you focus on the line, you will make mistakes. So if you build a warm, close, loving relationship with somebody of the opposite sex, when you're in a committed relationship, you're going to lead to problems. It's going to lead to problems. And the only way to avoid that, and we'll discuss how far back from the line you're supposed to go, if you're supposed to be like Angela or awkward. But it definitely, the Torah's directive is clear. I don't want you on the line. At some point, you have to get close behind that line as well.
Got it. So I guess the next question is, okay, so how do you know when you're getting close to that kind of, no man's land? Where do you start being you're getting too close to the line, start kind of retreating a little bit?
Yeah. So look, the first thing to say is, I wish I knew the answer, right? Because we could then redraw the lines and say it's exactly this. And you will find, just quite frankly, that some things are based on also what's considered to be normal and what's considered to be healthy, normal interaction. And it can be based on different community standards, different customs from culturally. I'm from England, if you're from America. I think we have to first of all define what is normative behavior. So it's going to depend on different cultures, but in general, if normative behavior is to engage in a friendly way with your coworker and to say good morning to them, and you decide to be a zealot or extra religious in the idea of piety, and you decide to ignore your coworker because they're a member of the opposite sex, that's probably not appropriate because it's not a normative standard of behavior. As soon as you step into territories where it gets can you define this as normative? Then already it starts to get gray. I'm not saying that's already prohibited, but I'm saying that the first step is the first question to ask is this considered to be a normative behavior? You find it in Talmudic law, this idea when it comes to tort law and damages, where if something is, let's say it comes to risk taking, people ask, are you allowed to go skydiving? You're allowed to do all these dangerous activities. And the Torah places very serious prohibitions around placing yourself in unnecessary danger. At the same time, if it's considered to be a normative behavior, that is to say that most people would define this category of behavior as a standard normal thing, then it's perfectly permissible, right? So, hezeka hishayni motzo, if the damage is expected, or if the damage is more likely to occur, or the danger's increased, then you're already getting to murky waters. So applying that same sort of standard over here in relationships with members of the opposite sex, how does someone look at you? If you were to take the screenshot of Jim and Pam interacting, freeze frame it and play it to somebody else, or you would play it to a spouse, if they would see that, how are they going to look at that? Would you define that as normative behavior? I would suggest that in the office it wasn't. I would suggest it crossed the line already way before they ultimately kissed. That sort of flirtatious, friendly behavior, that wasn't just a pleasantries, being, friendly and warm, it already had crossed that line. And it's almost like if you were to take, a video of their interaction, show it to Roy at different moments, how would he feel? I'm sure he wouldn't feel happy about it.
So actually that's a really good point. And truth is, it's pretty clear that Pam herself has misgivings. Like, I think it was in season 2 when they're kind of like joking around, and then at one point, Jim picks Pam up and kind of like her shirt spikes up a little bit, and so it's showing her stomach. And then one of the coworkers looks around and sees it, and Pam immediately kind of almost like goes cold, and she's like, "Oh, that line is crossed." And Jim apologizes. It was clearly like, you know what I mean? There was obviously no kiss, but it was just almost too much flirtatiousness. So can we comment about that? I guess, how do we take that in terms of Pam understood that they were crossing a line? So how do we in terms of Pam knew, but she still wanted to flirt, but didn't want to go too far. It seems kind of like what's Jim supposed to do in that scenario?
Right. So I want to make sure I'm speaking to different people within your audience. But I think it's important to just lay out a little bit of the Jewish sort of traditional perspective, and then maybe we'll talk to what communicative norms are in other communities, if that's okay. So just the first thing just to point out is that in traditional Orthodox circles, one of the ways in which we deal with this dynamic of where is the line is we make a very clear mark around any form of physical contact with the opposite sex. So, for example, that scenario where he lifts her up, and that, especially when you're talking about playful hugs and wrestling, the line happened so quickly that they got crossed that they almost, didn't realize it. So in a traditional Orthodox setting, the line is marked by any form of contact. Even if it's not meant to be affectionate or what we call kirva, which you try to create closeness or sort of sexual energy, it's just drawn there. Now, obviously, in most community standards outside of the Orthodox world, that's not the norm. But at the same time, I think as soon as you get into that realm of physical contact, even if it's considered to be normal, a handshake at work is normal, outside of anything that is standard normative behavior, I think we have to be real and say, why is that happening? Why are you hugging playfully a coworker? And for me, especially, I can just see it so clearly in dynamics at the workplace. As soon as it's anything more than a traditional handshake, even if it's like a pat on the back or a hug, you kind of already walking down a slippery slope. And I would suggest that the line is already crossed in terms of creating and building that emotional closeness that the Torah would say is already over the boundaries of what's acceptable and encouraged.
And that makes sense. So I guess turning back a bit because I think this is definitely one of the themes you want to talk about. So how do we deal with, and we said that, Jim and Pam is kind of like almost like the ideal relationship. It was like so nice. Jim was interested even though he knew that Pam was engaged.
Yeah.
So I guess I kind of want to focus on, I guess we could say what Jim did was inappropriate on the one hand, but on the other hand, especially later on, once Pam breaks up with Roy, they eventually have another conversation. And Pam's like, look, I'm thinking of getting back together, but I want to be 100% transparent or honest. I kissed Jim. And then Roy gets violent and starts throwing stuff at the bar. And it's one thing that The Office did very well is you watch these action movies and it's not scary, but when you're watching The Office, wow, that kind of outburst is really frightening. And Pam, thank God he didn't get physical with her, but Pam quickly takes her leave and is thanks, see you later. And it's over. But we could say that, Pam was conflicted. She clearly had some feelings for Roy. She was scared. She didn't know what to do. So Jim was comforting her. And at the end of the day, they weren't married. Now, if she was a married woman, I can see how Jim was just automatically crossing a line, but they weren't. They were engaged for 3 years. There was no date. Eventually there was. But the point is, it was this kind of long, drawn out, interminable, engagement. So was Jim, especially since Pam was reciprocating, was it really inappropriate for Jim to kind of pursue the girl he liked? She was responding. How do we view that? Because that's fair. And ultimately, he was right. Pam did like him. And Pam's relationship was toxic. So I know that's kind of a long intro, but I guess I do want to approach it from that because it's really nice to say, oh, it was inappropriate. It shouldn't be done. But Pam's relationship was toxic. So how do we deal with all those factors?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to pick up on. One is really this distinction between engaged versus married, I think, and how the Torah views these two stages versus, let's say, the rest of the world, the secular world. And then that part, by extension, is it appropriate for Jim to pursue Pam if she's only engaged? So just the first thing, I'm assuming you'll guide me here, Ophir, but I'm assuming your audience wants to hear a little bit about the Torah's perspective and the Jewish lens, and then we can discuss how it plays out in everyday scenarios. So from the Torah's perspective, being engaged is pretty serious. It's not this kind of like casual thing, like you get down on one knee and you give a ring and that's it. Like it's actually a very serious thing. Now it's so serious, in fact, that the technical engagement only happens right under the marriage ceremony, under the chuppah, because of this idea that when you commit to somebody else, the level of seriousness is so important that it inevitably has to lead to marriage. So much so that in earlier Talmudic times, people would get engaged in the proper way, and then there'd be this gap between the engagement period known as the Kiddushin and the second phase, the marriage, known as Nisuin. But because it became such an important thing to make sure that it actually led to the marriage, the rabbis instituted that the first phase of the real betrothal, like when you think your Jewish religious friends are getting engaged, they're not really engaged. We'll discuss it's something called a l'chaim, which is you have a little a sort of casual commitment in a certain sense. It is something, and you make some sort of stipulation, but the real stipulations of I'm agreeing to become engaged to you from the Jewish lens happens right before the marriage. And it's because of this very reason. When I commit to you, I'm in. And this isn't this casual thing that I can kind of break up. So just from the Torah's lens, an engagement, a real engagement, what we call the Kiddushin, which means to separate and say, I'm excluding everybody else in the world from this relationship. I haven't committed to you yet, but I'm excluding everybody else. That's phase one. It's separation. That's a really important thing. So from the Jewish lens of how we should feel about a real, authentic engagement, it's absolutely the same thing as marriage. That's how the Torah would view it.
Interesting. But is that how we view it? Like in terms of even kind of like more casual conversation, you're right. Once you hit Kiddushin, which is like effectively almost step one of marriage. But now when people say like we're engaged, that's not in terms of even like Torah circles. It doesn't mean Kiddushin. It just means we plan on getting married.
Exactly. And that's what I'm getting to, is that I first just want to put out there that the idea of engagement, the way we've sort of coined it now, is very different to how the traditional sense of engagement should be.
I see what you're saying. Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So I want to just bring out this idea that there are two parts to creating a marriage, a healthy, vibrant marriage. Part one is just excluding everybody else. It's not even picking the girl. It's saying Kiddushin literally means to separate, right? That I'm separating everybody else outside, and I'm going to turn to you in a moment and commit to you. And that's phase one. And that's really how the Torah views marriage. It needs to be some level, and this is why it will become relevant in terms of emotional relationships with other people, is that in order to protect that unit of marriage that you ultimately build, you have to keep that sort of fence, that separation with other people, kind of present throughout your marriage for it to really be healthy and vibrant. So, of course, that's why I want to get to like how we view Kiddushin today, how we view betrothal today, being engaged. It's nowhere near that level of seriousness. It just isn't. So I would acknowledge that, especially in the secular world and in the Pam and Roy's dynamic, people are engaged for years. So it kind of feels like, well, I have to wait to this girl forever. So, I personally, what I feel like, is somebody fair game, or is it, open season because they're engaged, even if it's not? I wouldn't feel comfortable with that. But it's not the level of seriousness with which the Torah speaks about the traditional engagement.
Got it. Interesting. So actually, yes, I'll ask for a bit more clarification. So since that is, in terms of it was this interminable engagement for 3+ years, there was no date set until like the middle of the second season. So, I mean, I guess at that point, should Jim have backed off once there was a date? Because it almost seemed like Pam wasn't and she was happy at the time, but she clearly kept engaging with Jim. So I guess what Jim did inappropriate at the end of the day? Like, sorry, I just want a bit more clarification. Like, could Jim have, was it open season effectively?
I don't think that you'll find anybody who would say yes, who would say, well, very few people would say, sure, go hit on an engaged girl. Like, yeah, that's perfectly okay. And that's where we get into this discussion of like sort of the red line, and we'll talk about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. No one would say like, yeah, she's engaged, it's fine, it's fair season. At the same time, I think what was so frustrating about the whole dynamic, both from Jim and Pam's perspective, is what took them so long to be honest with where the relationship was going. So I think that's kind of both. We'll start with Jim's perspective because this is what we're discussing now. Is it fair for Jim to try and flirt a little bit with her? I mean, technically she's not married. He's not doing anything, overtly inappropriate. But I think where I would look at it as sort of a non-ideal relationship to aspire to is he did it for years. He knew from the very beginning, and it comes out later that he sort of bought this ring for her, pretty much after he met her because he wanted to marry her. I think the line where it got inappropriate was he should have really confessed his feelings a lot earlier. And there were so many times, and that's what the producers of the series did. They kind of egged you on to say, he's about to tell her, but he doesn't quite tell her. So he kind of really dragged it a lot longer than it needed to be dragged. And I think for everybody involved, because we're really talking about the mitzvah, what we call the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your neighbor like like yourself. How would you want to be treated in the same shoes? So I'm sure Roy would have just wanted this to be more upfront at the beginning. I think that's kind of the dilemma here is it open season? I mean, technically from the letter of the law, yes, he didn't do anything wrong in terms of until the kiss or stepping over the boundaries. But I think if you ask anybody, is he keeping to the spirit there? I don't think people would agree with that. I think I would say it would seem like he's not being real with his emotions and not being real with how he's feeling. And that ultimately is just not going to lead to a healthy dynamic.
And that is definitely, I mean, it's hard to push back against that. I think that's reasonable. That being said, it's also kind of on Pam. Pam has to take some kind of level of responsibility here. If she should, first, she clearly did feel like at some points Jim was going too far. But Pam kept engaging. So from Jim's perspective, he's like, if she wasn't interested, she should just tell me. And at some point, Pam said, I can't. I just can't. I still plan on proceeding with the marriage to Roy. And Jim leaves. He transfers offices. So you could see, once she made it clear, he acted and left. I would say that's actually pretty straightforward. How do we view Pam? Pam is engaging this clearly because she's not happy with Roy. So, but I guess let's take it from that angle for a minute.
So you're absolutely right. In any dynamic, anybody who says that it's all one-sided or it's Jim's fault or I'm on the team Pam and saying it's all Jim's fault or I'm on team Jim, it's all Pam's fault, it's clearly not true. In these dynamics, it always takes two people. So the blame, so to speak, for where this was going or the way in which it developed lies on both of them. Absolutely, Jim should have confessed his feelings earlier and just been upfront. But there's no question that Pam, and I think the way this series plays out is that most people would feel more annoyance with Pam because she refuses to even admit to herself. She doesn't even want to say out loud or admit to herself that she really has feelings for Jim. And she absolutely takes on a huge level of, maybe even the greater level of responsibility because she ultimately is the one that's engaged. And for all intents and purposes, while it might not be fully appropriate for Jim to pursue Pam, he isn't the one that's engaged. She is, and she has the greater level of responsibility because of that. So I totally think that Pam's inability to be real and confront, regardless of whether it's appropriate or not, but just to confront what she's actually going through is where the lines get crossed. Because she completely leads Jim on the whole time. This idea that she sort of feigns this innocence, I had no clue that you really liked me. Once Jim confesses, I'm sorry if I misled you. I'm sorry if I gave you the wrong impression in our relationship. That's just not true. She clearly did. She knows what she was doing, but she won't admit it to herself. She won't be real. So that's definitely fault her shoes because of that.
That's actually, and that leads to my next question in terms of being true, because another time where we actually see the same dynamic, not as seriously, but the same dynamic kind of play out is when Jim moves back to Scranton and with Karen, played by Rashida Jones. So at that point, in terms of a lot of people are like, Karen did nothing wrong. She was just this great girl who had a great relationship with Jim. However, Jim was also not being fully honest with Karen. And that kind of led to one of my questions being, people are complicated. And especially if you've been in a previous relationship, often, there could be previous feelings that haven't been 100%. Was it wrong for Jim? Jim entered the relationship with Karen. They then, in turn, because their branch closed down, they moved back to Scranton. Jim knew that Pam was still there. And the thing is, Jim is still in a relationship with a girl, even though he still had relationship feelings for Pam. So at what point you could say, well, it was wrong for Jim to date Karen, but when do you have to be 100% committed to the relationship? Because Karen eventually confronts Jim and asks him, do you still have feelings for Pam? And Jim, to his credit, says, yes, I do. And so at that point, Karen obviously gets pretty upset. But like, there's Pam is engaged to Roy, but has feelings for Jim. Jim is dating Karen and has feelings for Pam. Like, obviously it's a very messy situation, and thankfully, like, resolves itself well. But can we expect a person to be 100% in? Like, I guess let's deal with that for a second.
Yeah. So I think you bring up a really important point. And just as we're discussing, you can see how messy and complicated this gets. Jim always wants to kind of pay back Pam this sort of like subtle way, like, hey, you put me through this torture. I'm going to put you through this torture. He did nothing technically wrong, but you can just see the dynamic isn't really healthy. And it's also not really fair to Karen because she kind of gets thrown along with this whole thing. But I think this touches on a very important point in the Torah lens when it comes to all relationships, but in particular, relationship between a man and a woman and marriage, which is that people make the mistake in thinking is that I need to, be in a relationship for a long time. I need to understand and see if this person is right for me. And eventually, years down the road, I'll commit and we'll get married. The Torah lens is actually the opposite. Of course, you don't go blindly into marriage. You have to like the person. You have to be attracted to them. There has to be chemistry, and there has to be a certain healthy foundation. But it's nowhere near as much as people think. That the love comes as a result of the commitment. Everything else before that, you're just opening yourself up to a can of worms and all this complication that we're describing. The Torah's ideal of relationship is, therefore, not to elongate an engagement, for example, is to whatever period of time you need to practically put the wedding together and all the logistics. And in religious circles, it's obviously a lot quicker and it's a few months. But even if it needs to take a year, and that's fine, like, let it take a year because of logistical reasons, but not for reasons of understanding if we're compatible. Because you know what? You're always going to find people out there that can be charismatic, engaged, that you can be drawn to. Almost every spouse relationship, you could find some faults in that other person, and you can find co-workers that don't have those faults, and you could be drawn to them. And all this dynamic that we're describing now could have been easily avoided. I wouldn't say easily. It could have been helped a lot had they already committed to that other person. So when you talk about this idea of commitment, is he really committed? None of them are committed. This engagement phase was very casual, and then Jim's in a new relationship with Karen, and that changes very quickly. From the Torah lens, the healthy relationship can only start if you're fully in and you're fully committed. Even then, you have to be careful. Absolutely. We can talk about boundaries around married people's relationships as well. But the starting point is the commitment. It doesn't come sort of once you see if the person's great and you spend years and years in doing that, because you're always going to be sort of crossing murky waters in the workplace and when you're out there in the world. But actually, the relationship starts from a place of commitment. The famous idea I'm sure you've heard this many times, the idea of the word love in Torah thought, right? Love is ahava. And the root of that word ahava is hav, to give. The love comes as a result of my commitment to giving. It's not like, oh, I love this person, therefore I give to them. No, I'm committed to giving to you fully, unconditionally, and then my love comes and flows as a result of that. And it's an important lens to just look at, because I think it does avoid a lot of these murky situations where you're kind of half in and half not in. So even if you're, maybe not a religious person listening to this, and you're not willing to take the full Torah perspective and sort of commit to the marriage before you're fully in, I do think that the concept is still there, which is the greater the level of the commitment, the greater the ability of love. It's when things are murky and the commitment is not ironclad that things like this dynamic can take place.
That's fascinating. I actually remember in my early years of marriage, I went to this marriage vad, this kind of marriage series of classes. And I remember one of the first questions being asked was, what's like the foundation of the marriage? So often I think people would say like love, you have to love each other. And he said, no, it's commitment. You have to be committed to the marriage. Sometimes the love won't be there. Even if you love them, sometimes the love's not going to be there. Yeah. But if you're committed, you're always committed. And therefore, even when the love's not there, you'll still act appropriately and in a loving fashion. Even if you're not feeling it internally, you'll act appropriately externally.
Absolutely. And to such an extent, I just wanted to draw out as well that, you mentioned with Roy and Pam's dynamic, it's not a healthy relationship, right? Roy does not seem to encourage Pam's dreams and what she's going for. It's not the healthiest dynamic. I would suggest, though, that the dynamic between Jim and Pam is not only as a result of that. They were flirting. They were co-workers, and they were having a good time. And I wonder if Pam it wouldn't be as Hollywood, it wouldn't be as well scripted for Netflix. But even if Pam had a good relationship with Roy, the dynamic between her and Jim still could have fostered. It still could have been there. The only thing that would have been clear then is that it's clearly inappropriate and it's crossing the line. But it just reiterates the Torah's main point is that when you're committed to somebody, the greater the level of the commitment, that's when the love flows and the relationship grows. As soon as it feels like unsure, where are we going? Am I just in this to make Pam jealous, like with Karen, or am I really committed to you? Then it gets really difficult.
Yeah, I have to say that's actually a really sobering thought. You're right. What if Roy was a good guy? I think people would really, they'd see Jim as like a homewrecker.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, unfortunately I had a situation, somebody came in my role as a rabbi, somebody came to me and there was this dynamic of, unfortunately, an extramarital affair, and there was nothing wrong with the marriage. It wasn't this like terrible marriage. But they allowed this close emotional relationship to foster with somebody from the opposite sex. And that's what led to it. So I think it's really important just to reiterate that there's two elements to this Pam and Jim thing. One is just the fact that she wasn't married, and that created its own level of uncertainty about where this was going. And then the second thing is clearly realizing that they became too close. They really were too close. And if people ask me, it's a well-known debate, can you really be friends with the opposite sex in a healthy way? The answer is kind of no. From the Torah perspective, it's really like you can be friendly. You can absolutely be friendly. We're not suggesting that you should, keep your head down all the time. I know there's certain communities where there's different customs, but in general, by and large, a religious Jew, a upstanding individual, they should be friendly to members of the opposite sex. They should be cordial. They should smile and greet them. They don't have to be super serious. There are different debates about whether you can shake hands with members of the opposite sex, but even for a lot of people that say that's fine if it's a normal way of conducting business, all of that's okay. But as soon as you're creating a friendship that is with laughter and sharing secrets and sharing your challenges in your own relationship, which is kind of what happens also in there with Jim and Pam, you've already crossed the line. And some people might say that's extreme, but this is clearly where it leads to if you don't take that approach.
Yeah, I hear.
Yeah.
And now that we're talking about like kind of like what if Pam and Roy had a healthy relationship, and you're saying Roy is not so encouraging. So I actually want to shift towards once Jim and Pam finally, like Pam is broken off with Roy, Jim and Pam do start dating. And by the way, just as a quick pointer, I was watching some of the clips just to kind of get a refresher. It's been a while. And Jim bought a ring a week after they started dating. So that at least was like, it wasn't like the week after he met her. It was the week after they actually formally started. Yeah. So like that, yeah, it wasn't so bad, thankfully. But so Jim and Pam are together. And then, over the next few seasons, we see they're dating and then they get married and then they kind of like, there are struggles in their relationship, which many people, it was kind of interesting. There were like different perspectives on this. I was checking online just to see how people felt about it. And some people were like, yeah, it was so boring. They're just kind of like, now they're together and there's no more tension anymore. And then other people were kind of kicking back against it. They're like, dude, it's like, what are you talking about? That's what married life looks like in terms of you're doing the same thing day in and day out. And there's struggles and you have to figure it out. So I do want to talk about that in terms of, it was very fresh and exciting in the first few seasons, and then get together and everyone's excited, and then it just kind of gets kind of boring.
Yeah.
So
I think it's a really important point. And I don't know if you noticed also, one of the big things that the directors did is that the moment that kind of Pam and Jim finally get together, it's almost anticlimactic. It's not this big, fanfare. It's kind of happens very subtly. Jim comes back and says, hey, are you free for a date? And she says yes. And you don't really see the date. They just kind of are automatically together. I think one of the things that the show did really well was, as soon as the relationship became real and became authentic, it kind of, some of the glamour went away. And that is actually what happens in marriage. I've had so many single people tell me after they get married, I feel duped. Where's the sparks flying and everything? Sometimes people just go in with the wrong perspective. In the Torah outlook, the way God created relationships, and really a lot of things in the physical world, is you start with this spark of inspiration. That spark is then sort of meant to be there to guide you to see what to aspire to. The spark is taken away, and then you have to work to bring it back. And you see this in many different areas in Torah thought and discussion. It's also true in the physical world, by the way. If you're in a room with noise and sort of this constant noise, initially you'll hear it, And in order to kind of notice it, you have to change something and shift it. Your senses are kind of attuned initially, they're very heightened, and then they get dulled. And you have to do something different to bring them back. So the way we understand, like, and I'll get to this point about how this affects Jim and Pam when they start really dating. From the Torah lens, the sparks and the energy and the sexual tension, all that is healthy. It's supposed to be there. It's there to be able to attract two people together. If people are busy and life is busy, if we didn't have that force bring us together, you'd push it off marriage till you're 50. We have this natural bonding chemistry between us, and it's supposed to be there. It's healthy. It draws us together. And God almost gives you a gift where you see the qualities in the other person. You almost downplay their shortcomings, or you kind of ignore. You think it's cute when she does this or he does that at the beginning of the relationship. And then you get married and you realize, oh gosh, that's actually annoying, right? But there's a methodology behind that madness. And if you understand it, that the way that Torah views this is that God gives you a gift of being undeservedly drawn to each other with more excitement, more passion together. And he wants you to see this is how relationships should feel. Once you've experienced it, I'm going to take away the natural feeling that created just by, without you deserving it. Now I want you to earn it. Now I want you to earn it through the acts of giving, through the commitment you create with each other. So the truth is, a real, healthy, normal marriage, once the initial honeymoon phase has passed, the sparks won't fly in the same way initially. The things that drew you together that you loved about the other person, they might not be present anymore. So now what? Now what do you have to do? Now you have to work. And the series did a good job of kind of showing that dynamic, that once Jim and Pam got together, they had the regular struggles of every couple. What do you do about kids? What do you do about career? One person wants to move here, another person wants to go there. That's real life, and that's real marriage. So it doesn't mean that the relationship became kind of, maybe from the viewer's perspective, boring. It became real. And I think the show actually did a really good job of showing the dynamic of a real marriage, which is that it's not always sparks flying. But again, when you come back to that commitment, if I'm committed to you, it's because I'm committed to you that I'm in and I'm really doing something well. I was just talking to somebody this morning actually about their job. And he said to me, he was telling me about the struggles in his job. And he said, you know what? Yeah, but I'm a lifer in this position. Like, I'm just going to do this for life. And I'm okay with that. I'm sort of happy with that. I said, yeah, it's because you're so committed that you're making this work, right? If it was anyone else, they would just jump ship. But because you view yourself as like, I'm in this job for a while, like this is my passion. This is what I want to do. That's what's going to help you succeed. And
Wow.
It's the same in any relationship.
Wow. I didn't see where you're going with that, but that's I guess that's why the first thing you have to say is like the foundation of any marriage is the commitment. Because if you're not committed, then your eyes will always be straying to something else. But that actually looks pretty nice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then sort of to get back to the point you were asking about, this dynamic that people say, okay, now they become boring. There's a regular married couple. Yes, that's marriage. And people marriage doesn't mean being unhappy. Let me be clear. There's also unhealthy dynamics, but you can be very happy and fulfilled, but it means that you're confronted with real problems and real challenges. And that those things are the things that happen in every single couple's dynamic. And to such an extent, I think towards the end of the series, they show this new dynamic where Pam starts to confide in one of the cameraman, I think, and they almost like cross the line of their own sort of unhealthy dynamic and relationship. They don't go that far. And I think the series did a good job of not doing that. But it just shows you how even Pam, who were this ideal, if you're not careful with your dynamic with an opposite sex, it can lead to places. And because the show's directors decided she can't do that and cheat on Jim now after everything that they've gone through, that's not real life. In real life, that could have absolutely happened. It just shows you no matter how credible your story was of how you found each other, how this sort of romantic thing happened and you found each other at work, you can fall down the same trap if you aren't careful with that. So coming back to that original question of, where's the line? When as soon as it comes to confiding the opposite sex about your own dynamic and relationship and expressing those emotions, you've crossed the line. And that's what Pam was doing there. And that's another very real struggle, even in marriage, even relationships down the road. If you aren't careful with how you're sharing with the opposite sex, especially the emotional bonds that you're creating, it's going to be a slippery slope.
Well, interesting. And just to clarify, it seems like like what exactly you said, if you're not being careful, was this only if Pam's not being careful, or is it also if like is it also almost kind of like with Jim? Because the fact is, it seems like Pam was looking for an emotional outlet that she wasn't getting in the marriage. Like, is that also probably like the part of the being careful? Because like Pam was kind of feeling a little bit abandoned. Like,
Yeah.
I want to explore that a bit in terms of like when you said, if you're not careful about what exactly?
So it's a good point you're bringing up. So I think it's a separate thing about Jim's responsibilities or in terms of not fulfilling Pam's emotional needs. So is she going to go and get them somewhere else? There's absolutely, Jim was at fault for that. He clearly wasn't giving his wife enough of her emotional needs. We'll discuss, what the Torah's obligations are towards a man's wife and vice versa in a second. But that doesn't excuse Pam's behavior. The part that was inappropriate was you don't share the struggles in your marriage with somebody of the opposite sex in a, closet where they were, I think with that cameraman, like somewhere secluded and private. It's one thing if you're out in the open, even then it probably wouldn't be the best idea. But where she overstepped the boundaries was discussing her relationship, how she felt abandoned by Jim with another attractive man. Where sparks could absolutely fly. So in that regard, I think she overstepped the mark. You bring up a good point in terms of the fact that Jim really wasn't doing enough for Pam when he was away. In the Torah's outlook, when a man signs his marriage contract, it's very one-sided. The man has to commit to providing for his wife's needs, all of her needs, her sexual needs, her emotional needs, her physical needs. He has a commitment to do that. Don't think it's all one-sided in every respect, because a woman also has to take care of things. But in terms of the way the contract is written up, a man has an obligation to fulfill all of his wife's needs. And this is the document called the ketubah that we read under the marriage ceremony. And a portion of that is her emotional needs. And when Jim was off gallivanting, creating his business, he clearly left a hole that wasn't being met. And he should take some responsibility for that. It doesn't excuse Pam going to confide in a male friend or a male person. She should have used a female, colleague. Right. But Jim does have a responsibility also to make sure that even though he's traveling, he can't ignore his wife's needs.
So those are good points. And truth is, I like that. I actually kind of like that you're saying like Pam, we understand why Pam did what she did, but Pam still crossed the line. And we're kind of looking at their responsibilities, not in terms of their rights. Like Pam, I had the right to emotional. It's like, yeah, okay, you're right. Jim should have given you more attention, but that doesn't mean you can go talk to that guy. And Jim, like, it's on you. You need to make sure to fulfill your wife. So I guess the show addressed it, which was kind of nice. It was like a nice, good feel. Feel good is a nice way to kind of like wrap up the show. I guess to conclude our discussion, let's focus on that a little bit. How do we? I guess, was that realistic? Was that ideal? Is that? Do you think it was just kind of a Hollywoody thing to kind of have a nice sign off?
Yeah. So I think the show did a really good job of showing the natural and normal tensions that come up in marriage, even once you're committed to each other. But I think it did an unrealistic job of the makeup of the resolution, because you see the tensions at the highest, and then all of a sudden, like, Jim shows up and he's not going to go and pursue his business anymore. He gives her this hug and everything seems to be fine. And I just haven't seen that in relationships. I wish that was true. I wish it was that easy that you could almost like use the power of the hug to suddenly resolve the conflict. I think there was a few moments where he did that. He kind of came in, he listened to her and he hugged her. And maybe in a Hollywood setup, one hug is all it takes. I think there's some sort of song about that. Maybe one kiss is all it takes. But the sort of one physical act of can heal all the emotional scars. It doesn't really work that way. In the Torah's lens, the relationship between a husband and a wife has very clear times to focus on the physical aspect, the sexual energy, and then the emotional one. And they're actually supposed to be separate at times. And you see this a lot, that in any relationship, you have to have a physical side of the relationship, that strong sexual drive. You have to have an emotional connection, and also an intellectual one where you can have good conversations. And all three elements need to be present and addressed. I think what the show kind of did at the end was sort of use the physical acts of hugging or a kiss to kind of heal all the emotional bonds. And I just don't think that's realistic, and that's not the approach. I think really the more realistic path is that there is going to be conflict, and the way you're going to resolve that isn't through a hug or through a kiss. It's going to be through talking about it, discussing it, really maybe going to a third party to talk that out. And that's the only thing I think the show kind of maybe had a bit of a Hollywood ending with, that it showed the real conflicts of marriage, but it kind of didn't show the healthy resolution of it in a way that's realistic. And I think from the Torah's perspective, you can't use the physical intimacy to mask over and heal the emotional and intellectual scars. You really have to attack them with their right corresponding modality. So if there is an emotional lack in Pam and there's something happening, they have to deal with that from an emotional level. They can't use the physical affection to overcloud that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I guess I do have one question I want to wrap up with. And so we see, the beginning was kind of perhaps not ideal, but in terms of Jim and Pam's relationship, I suspect we might get a little bit, people might be upset. It's like, why are you ruining this? Like, we love Jim and Pam. Like, why are you dissecting it so carefully? So do Jim and Pam represent like an ideal relationship or a realistic one or a problematic one? Or is it just, you have to like bifurcate and be like, this part was really good. This part was less than ideal. I guess, like any concluding thoughts, taking a step back and looking at it from a wide camera lens.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really fair because we're all drawn to Jim and Pam. I mean, that's the goal of the show's, creators. They wanted you to be drawn to them. And I also like them. I'm like, you're rooting for them to get together. You sort of, you create that energy. So there's no question. I think there's something that draws us to them. And I think that when they are ultimately together, I think what's so appealing about it is they do have a strong emotional and intellectual relationship as well. You see them talking, you see them bonding emotionally and laughing. You don't see the physical side on camera so much, which is actually really good because it shows you that they have this multifaceted dynamic in their relationship. I think their playfulness, the fact that they prank Dwight all the time together, like it shows an energy in a relationship that we really all aspire to with our spouse. You don't want to just have a boring relationship. You want to have somebody that you can laugh with and bring that energy of lightness, and feeling joy. So there's no question that the dynamic that they ultimately create is really fun, and it's really enjoyable. And they seem like really committed. Once they're in, they work through their problems and they work through any issues that come up. So I'm definitely not here team bashing them. What I do want to say that if you're trying to extrapolate, this is where you have to sort of draw the distinction between a show and real life. And say that from a show perspective, get drawn in. They're trying to draw you in emotionally to them because they seem like really lovely people and they have a multifaceted dynamic to their relationship. It's not just a physical relationship. It's an emotional and intellectual one. And people like that. And it's a fun and lighthearted one. At the same time, if somebody were to say to me, like, this is the ideal to aspire to, I don't think so because the foundations of the relationship really started in a very rocky way. Now, it could be that somebody else has that dynamic and you started in a place that was maybe not the best, but you got to a better place. That's fine. That's okay. But I don't think we should idealize it more than it is. And what it is a really fun relationship. What it is a really real relationship, I think. And I myself, when I see the show and you root for them and you like them. But at the same time, I think we do have to dissect as well if we're trying to at least look through a Torah lens and see, did the relationship start in a healthy and appropriate way? I think we have to be real and say, no, it didn't. And the lessons that we can learn from that are when you are having interpersonal dynamics with members of the opposite sex, you have to be careful who you share with and what kind of dynamic you create with them. There is no exact line that I can tell you, but I can tell you that the Torah is very clear on getting removed from that line. By sikri, do not come close to it. And just to maybe conclude with this idea of there's always the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Right? We have everything in Torah discussion is built around that. We have the laws of Shabbat and we have the spirit of Shabbat. Right? We have the laws of relationship and you have the spirit of the relationship. If you have one without the other, it's not going to work. It's kind of like that art form, pointillism, the art that's made up of dots. There's a painting that you create imagery through dots. If you go super close to the painting, all you see is dots. You have to pull back to kind of see how it looks like this beautiful image. That interface between looking into the details and pulling back to the bigger picture is really important. And in every area of Jewish life, you could technically do the right thing and still miss the mark. Nachmanides the Ramban famously said that you can, in the Torah portion of Kedoshim, of being holy, when it says you shall be holy, he says this is an injunction to not just take the letter of the law, but to go beyond and use the spirit of the law as well. Because you can just take the letter and say, listen, I didn't sleep with somebody from the opposite sex. I didn't touch them. I didn't do anything physically inappropriate. But if you're building an emotional connection, a strong drive with somebody else, that's clearly overstepping the mark. So I can't sit here and tell you, none of us can say what that mark is. But I think the clear point that we want to draw out is that Jim and Pam's relationship was absolutely inappropriate at the beginning, and that shouldn't be the ideal. What happened afterwards, maybe, and probably was a little bit more on Pam to break that up with Roy earlier, once they came together and their dynamics between the two of them, their strong bonds that they have together, that's all components of a healthy relationship, the fun, the physical, the emotional, that's something you can aspire to. But just to remember that the Torah always wants you to think about the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. The letter of the law is don't have inappropriate relationships. Don't, be physically intimate with somebody else. But there's a whole spirit of the law. And building any sort of strong emotional connection with a member of the opposite sex is not advisable. So I think it's important to be sort of dissect and take the elements that are not healthy of their dynamic, and then also focus on the positives and the things that we can learn from them. Because ultimately, people like Jim and Pam. They're a great couple. They're cute. There's lots of things we can aspire to be, but we don't have to over-idolize them. We can respect the things that are good about them and also acknowledge the things that are questionable.
Rabbi Spinka, this was phenomenal. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. This was really, really great. And thank you for having me on your podcast. I think The Office is going to sort of stand the test of time as being a show that is consistently in sort of the top shows in America. And even I'm from England and there's an English version. I still think this is one area the Americans did better than the Brits. And it's a great series. It's a big accolade for me to say.
Yeah.
But I think, maybe I'll finish on this point that one of the things that draws you to the show is just how relatable it is. And at the very end of the series, Pam says this thing that, sometimes how the beauty is just in the ordinary life that we live. The beauty is just in this very ordinary, boring work setting. But that's kind of the point of life, is to draw out beauty from the ordinary settings of life. And I think that's kind of what draws people to the show. It's like this very ordinary setting. It's not this Hollywood action, but it's very real and relatable. And in a certain sense, it's kind of the Jewish lens, if I can put that on life, is we have to take the seemingly mundane, the ordinary things, a mere act of eating, and turn it into a spiritual endeavor. Something that seems so ordinary, just taking a fruit, an apple, and taking a bite, turning that into a moment of gratitude. Thanking God for the blessings that we're given. So it's kind of trying to infuse spirituality, meaning and purpose into the ordinary, the mundane. And that kind of line that Pam says at the end, that's kind of the point of this series, is that why they followed us around in this docu series was it seems so ordinary, and yet the relationships, the beauty of life, it's built in these ordinary settings.
Yeah, it's a beautiful point. And truth is, it'd be like, who's sort of like Scranton, Pennsylvania, right? But that's the whole point in terms of it's not the big city with like huge buildings and, thousands of people. It's like these ordinary people building their lives. And it's intriguing. Like you're drawn in. Yeah. And that's because it's real. That's great.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right.
So that's maybe a call to be more authentic and real and to try to find meaning in the ordinary.
Absolutely. Hey, Rabbi, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for tuning in to the Dilemmas on Screen, a Jewish Perspective podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. If you have any suggestions for a moral dilemma you'd like analyzed, feel free to send it over. Thanks again, and see you next time.